I'm gonna build you a house. Right here. Our house. I want to take Mildred up to D.C. to get married.
Are you sure about that?
By the power vested in me by the District of Columbia, I now pronounce you husband and wife.
In here?
Richard!
What you doing in bed with that woman?
I'm his wife.
That's no good here.
Richard Perry Loving being a white person and Mildred Jeter being a colored person did unlawfully cohabitate as man and wife.
Richard?
That ain't right!
I believe this is a battle that could go all the way to the Supreme Court.
We ain't hurting anybody.
The state of Virginia will argue that it is unfair to bring children of mixed race into the world.
Tell that woman to come over here.
I'm gonna raise my family here. I don't care what they do to us.
Get Peggy inside!
I can take care of you.
I know that.
I can take care of you.
I know we have some enemies, but we have some friends too.
You realize this case could alter the Constitution of the United States.
You think you'll lose?
We may lose the small battles, but win the big war.
Is there anything you'd like me to say to the Supreme Court justices of the United States?
Yeah. Tell the judge I love my wife.
Thanks, everybody. Guys, one more time. Give it up. I have to be nice to every movie that comes onto this stage, but this is one of my favorite films of the year. It's so beautiful, and you guys did an incredible job of, I would say, undermining every cliche that could possibly go into a movie like this and making a very subtle, beautiful, and sincere film. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I first want to talk about that. I want to talk about how you went about writing this script based off of this real story where, as I said, I think the cliche would be where most movies would go. They would go after a rousing courtroom drama, and you went after the small moments, sort of in between the rousing courtroom drama, a story about two people figuring out how it was possible for them to love each other in the midst of this.
Yeah, well, ultimately, I think this is, one of the greatest American love stories we have. And
I mean, they're named Loving. Come on.
I didn't make that part up. The thing is, I think, I've been married for 8 years. And when I think about really what marriage means and what love means and commitment means, it is all of these kind of small moments. It's not just the anniversaries and the big parts. It's sticking together through harrowing times, through mundane times. That's really how you express, I think, love for one another. And when I was first approached with Nancy Bursky's documentary, The Loving Story, which came out in 2011 on HBO, and I sat and watched that, and I watched these two people together and all this archival footage and all these amazing photographs, I just believed that they were in love. And I wanted to make a film from their point of view. I wanted to watch them step through this very harrowing period in their life when they were exiled from their home, when they were living in hiding in the countryside of Virginia. I wanted to see what that love was like day to day. And so that's the type of movie we made. But also it supports the facts. They didn't attend the oral arguments of the Supreme Court. So as a storyteller, you have this one goal, but also I think when you're doing something based on fact, you deal with the facts that you have at hand, and that was a fact. And it sent me down in my opinion, a more interesting path, which was, here are two people whose life is dependent on this legal system. that they're really unfamiliar with. It's happening over here in the distance, but their life depends on it.
And that system is also constantly calling into question whether or not it's appropriate for them to love each other, or if they could love each other.
Certainly, and whether or not it's appropriate that they have children together. I mean, that was the defense that the state of Virginia made at the time. And I find it very dramatic to actually not see the day-to-day calculations that the lawyers were making, which were fascinating. And these were two brilliant lawyers supported by the ACLU, which is an extremely important organization. I don't want to diminish the importance of the court case, but if you're following the point of view of Richard and Mildred Loving, you're just not involved in the day-to-day of it. And that's what we made a film about.
Joel, you're from Australia. You do an incredible job playing Richard Loving, who is from Virginia. Were there did you have any hesitations going into it? Were you worried about the accent? Were you worried about playing such a sort of large American figure, or a figure in American history?
No, I didn't have concerns about it. I really was excited to dive into it, and going a second round with Jeff felt like I just knew I was in safe hands. I did sort of worry about the responsibility of striving to play somebody in a very authentic way, striving for an authentic representation of the character, because I got that feeling from Jeff from the very beginning that across the board we were kind of taking a bit of a walk into their lives in a really true fashion across the board, through all design and costume, and that Ruth and I had a kind of both privilege and a responsibility to bring them onto the screen, and Richard. I looked enough like Richard, I think, for Jeff to give me the chance of doing it. But then on top of that, there was a particular way that he walked and moved and spoke.
How would you characterize that?
Well, I was just about to say there's a particular way that he walked and moved and spoke, and then there was a particular way in which he didn't speak very much at all, which made the accent, I thought, in the beginning a little easier to do because I didn't have to say very much. But then accent is so much about rhythm than just the sounds, and when you break an accent down, it's so much about rhythm. The difference between a California accent and different accents from different parts of the country. There's a certain rhythm that you got to catch, and if you're not saying much, it's very hard to feel like you're doing the accent justice. Jeff's only note to me after the first week was he wanted to understand me less, because you could hardly understand Richard. He just mumbled when he was forced to speak.
Did you ever worry about that, putting on screen that you would understand less? I mean, as much as you're trying to be realistic, was there ever a fear of like, oh, maybe that's too realistic and the audience wouldn't understand him? Which I don't think is the case. I do remember,
we needed to tell the judge I love my wife. We couldn't miss that one. But
that's the only line.
You could do mumble, 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 wife, and then
that one we had to nail. But it was more about, thinking of the voice in terms of just another part of behavior. It's not separated from his body language or his movements. It's all kind of part of the same thing. And I think his posture and his face, especially with an actor as talented as Joel, tells you as much as the lines. So the lines, in a way, start to become secondary once you reduce them. So, no, I was never really worried about it. I knew I had someone that was telling the story with their entire body and not just the words that come out of their mouth.
Nick, you're one of the funniest people I think around right now. You have a show on Broadway called Oh Hello on Broadway. I had seen Oh Hello twice before going to see this movie, and I have to say the first moment that you appeared on screen, I chuckled immediately. I just couldn't help it. But then you immediately sort of worked past that and brought a humanity to this character who existed in real life, and also a sort of a bit of a sense of humor, because he's kind of figuring it out along the way as well. What was it like bringing your sort of comedic sensibilities to something that was also quite subtle?
Well, I mean, it was Jeff. I got a call from Jeff kind of out of the blue about doing this movie, and it's the kind of thing that I've always wanted to be able to do, and can be tough sometimes for a comedian or a comedic actor to get the chance to do something that is slightly different. And so I credit Jeff, well, obviously just for hiring me. But it was. My feeling was it was so much of it was on the page. I wasn't intending to be overly comedic in it. I just was, there's something comedic about someone, my character's this lawyer who gets hired through the ACLU to come and help the Lovings, and he's really not qualified in a number of different ways to handle the enormity of this case. And so you see him sort of make a few different missteps and need to get help. And so there is something inherently sort of amusing about that. And I would, again, like Jeff, credit to Jeff and his writing and his directing, that there are moments in dramas that are comedic, and in real life there are funny things. And I would argue that like Bernie's stuff isn't funny in a bubble. It's because of like him interacting with Richard. So it's these like two very different kinds of men. Bernie, who in one scene, I think we realized has more lines in one scene than Richard has in the entire movie. And so, but it was I don't know. So it was really fun to be able to play that and play different levels of things and hopefully serve the story and the movie as well as possible.
And to your credit, I mean, even in the scene of Tell the Judge I Love My Wife, as important as Richard is in that scene, every time I cut away to Nick's character, I mean, he's right there in it. There's a heavy amount of emotion. And I remember on the day, Nick was able to really precisely calculate, because I think he actually teared up in one take. Yep. And he was like, do you want me to pull that back a little bit? I was like, yeah, just pull it back a little. So, I mean, I think so often we lump these actors into categories, but and Nick brought every bit of dramatic, weight that everybody else did. I just never get to say that. I wanted to say that.
I feel like telling him to pull back his tears a little bit at a sort of pinnacle moment in the movie is an incredible example of sort of everything that you do in this movie, which is instead of swelling the music there, and instead of having him, cry and put his arm on Richard Loving and say, "I'm with you, buddy," everything is handled with subtlety, which adds even more sort of respect and dignity to the film. Is that do you guys get a sense of that when you're making it as well? Do you sort of get a sense of where Jeff is coming from when you're on set and you're shooting these scenes and they're succinct and no one is sort of crying hysterically? Or
look, there's different kinds of directors. Obviously, there's in terms of the bigger sort of types of directors, bigger categories. There are some directors that will they'll set up these situations and they'll throw tons of cameras on it, or they'll shoot every angle, and then those directors, their precision and their real artistry happens in the edit suite, in the aftermath, and they have a kind of a fun time playing on set and getting options, and people are trying all different sorts of things, and then they go and they pack the lunchbox afterwards. Then there's a kind of director who's doing that work ahead of time, which is Jeff and a handful of others, where that thoughtfulness, mindfulness, real examination of character and the story from every angle is done before you arrive on set. So there is a feeling sometimes that, there's a feeling always that Jeff knows exactly how a scene is going to play out in his mind, and that he's open to other things that happen on the day. And then there are certain moments which I felt like I was... it was like I was trying to hit the center of the dartboard for him, because I knew that, every time I'm not being very articulate, but for example, with that line on the porch in the scene with Nick, it's like I felt like we were getting close to the center of the dartboard, but we weren't going to stop shooting until I hit the center of it. And the center of it was, I guess, in my mind, something Jeff had already imagine the tenor of the temperature and the tone of that moment. And you know, because I know that he's someone who's done that, has that mindfulness ahead of time, and he's not just scattergun shooting a movie and building it in post, I want to hit the center of the dartboard for him.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, like, I think when I read the script that Jeff had written, it's like you can see the movie, like it's so clearly, to me, was so clearly written. And then there's stuff that there's no way you could have seen when you read it on the page. But for example, there's a couple scenes that's like it's not a tiered, but it's like there's two moments in the movie where Joel cries that is shocking. It's not the moment where he says, "Tell the judge I love my wife." That moment is about Joel, but also those words and the sentiment of that. It's like when he's alone with Ruth, he's been drinking, and he says, "I can take care of you," and you see all of a sudden these tears coming out, and how emotional he is, or near the end at the press conference, and which I was in that scene. I didn't see it on the day, and it's like, ooh, like that's when Richard lets go, is like these in-between moments, or these moments that he's shocked by the emotion coming out. And it's a credit to Joel and Jeff that it's these other moments that where emotion overtakes you that is what makes Joel's performance so beautiful, and the movie work so well under Jeff.
Absolutely, and I think that scene on the bed where you cry and say, "I can take care of you," is a real testament to what kind of movie this is, in the sense that you've worked so hard to build the audience to a place where the one moment where he questions whether or not he can take care of her is almost the climax of the movie. This is how the institution has affected the love between this couple, and it's a testament to how subtle the movie has to be to sort of have that moment be a climax. Can you talk about building that throughout the film?
Well, for sure. I mean, every film that I've made, I have one scene that feels like the pressure point scene. And I could go through each of my films and point those out.
Oh, yeah,
but
now that I think of it,
We won't do that. But, you know, and that scene is the scene for me in this film. When I was doing my research, I read a quote from Mildred before she passed away in 2008. And we use it at the end of the film. And before she passed away, she said, "I miss him. He took care of me." And I was just floored by it, because through all of this stuff, through all these harrowing moments, that's what she thought about before she passed away. She was still thinking about him. And it seemed like she was honoring him by saying that. He took care of me. That, I don't know, that meant something.
And it had been 33 years since he passed away, right?
At
1975?
Yeah, at that point. And so I went and reverse engineered this scene of him coming home, because you have to think, as a couple, Richard's part in that had to be completely emasculated, especially in the 50s and 60s, when we're talking about the cult of domesticity, and the man goes out as a bricklayer and makes this living. He really wasn't able to take care of his family in the traditional sense. They took that away from him. And to have to go home and tell his wife, say it out loud, for a man like this, that just seemed tragic to me. And for her to have to support him and hold him up, because although she's saying, "I know you can," what we realize, I think, at that point in the film is that she's taking care of him as much as he's taking care of her, and you actually see the moment. You actually understand why they're together, why they've stayed together, why they didn't divorce. And it starts to really speak to the heart of what we're trying to say. But yes, in terms of, if you just looked at the film as a volume graph, if that is going to be your climax, if that's going to be your pressure point scene, everything else has to live in a certain area. And
I mean, even the moments where they have to deal with, like, face Jim Crow South, they have to face really obvious institutional racism. You know, you still kind of handle to a certain degree on a lower volume graph, I think, like you said.
Well, I think because if you take our sheriff, for example, who was a racist Southern sheriff, the things he says are so just so cruel that if you played that at all, if you played toward that, he would be over the top immediately in my mind. It's the same with kind of all these other scenes. I think they're so emotional. I think they're so charged with ideas of love and commitment that if you if you put your foot on the gas pedal at all, it just careens into a place that we've seen before and something that we believe less. And so yeah, it was a calculated restraint all the way through the thing that, in a strange way, I think makes it more impactful.
Yeah, you don't have to tell me I started crying in the first scene of the movie through the rest of it. Talk about casting Ruth Negga. She's unbelievable. Her eyes are the most expressive thing I think I've seen on screen in a really long time.
Her eyes are disproportionately sized to the rest of her face. And I say that in the most positive way. There's, as a cinematographer, that's, what you dream of. And, but, she came in, we auditioned. She was the first person to audition for the part. I wasn't familiar with her work. She came in.
She was the first, did you say?
She was the first person to walk in the door. And she sat down. We didn't talk at all. And she performed Mildred the way that you see in the film, which is extraordinary. She had obviously been studying the documentary like I had. And then after she was done, we started talking, and she spoke in an Irish accent. And I was shocked. I had no idea of her background. And it didn't matter, though, because she did more than an impersonation. I think she really embodied the spirit of this woman, which was a beautiful spirit. If you watch this doc, if you watch this footage, the way she speaks, what she says is flooring, but the way she speaks even, how delicate her voice is, you just immediately fall in love with her, and that's what happened with Ruth.
Yeah, there are two people, both Richard and Mildred, who are, you see in the documentary, and I think you capture beautifully in the film, who are extremely strong without being overly self-aware about their strength and everything that they're doing. Everything comes from a very sincere place.
Oh, for sure. I think when you look at Richard's reaction in the first scene with Bernie Cohen, Bernie's talking about taking this case to the Supreme Court. And Richard's just saying, why don't you go talk to the judge? Just tell him we're not hurting anybody. Just let us back in the state, and we won't bother anybody, which is a beautiful idea, but it's also extremely simplistic and naive, really. And that was Richard's approach. I think Mildred matures into the most active, character or participant in the couple, for sure. And I think that's true to life. I think she was aware of their place in things. But even in that, there is this quiet fortitude that is as opposed to grabbing a sign and going and marching in the March of '63 in Washington, even though they were blocks away. That's not the type of people they were, and that's okay. That's okay because they still managed to change the laws in this country in a significant way.
Absolutely. Before I go to the audience for questions, Nick, I have to ask you a question about Oh Hello, because it's a New York show. I think there's a few people in this audience who've seen it.
It's an important show.
You guys got Alan Alda.
Yes.
You got him. Was he for the opening night or like around?
Alan Alda was our opening night guest.
So my question is, what did he think of the show? What did he think of George and Gil?
We've been after him for years to do something with us, and he's properly ignored us for that time. And then he heard enough about it and came in. He didn't know much about the show, but he came in, and our characters are based like he is the archetype, the ideal man to George and Gil. So having him do the show opening night felt like just the culmination of about 10 years of work. And he was amazing. He's a trained improviser. He was really excited about the possibility of getting on stage and kind of letting go a little bit. And then we had like a 40-minute conversation backstage with him. He told us amazing stories. And then we got on stage and it was just the most fun. He was down we did an improvised exercise at one point, and he just was so sharp and so funny. And I think he's going to come back and do another one. He had a good time. So that was the height of it. It's one of those things where, we've based these characters so deeply on him as a linchpin for us. And to have him participate in the show was just the coolest, most ridiculous thing in the world.
The show is one of the craziest, silliest things. I think it's the most punk rock thing that's ever been on Broadway. Have there been any crazy reactions from audience members? I heard Wolf Blitzer got up and went to the bathroom.
Wolf
in the middle
Blitzer
of it.
was, yeah, there's a period at the end of the show where I go out into the crowd to say goodbyes, and I clocked Wolf, because you don't mistake Wolf Blitzer for anyone. You're not like, oh, is that? No, that's Wolf Blitzer. And so I saw him in the crowd, and I was like, all right, I'll finish by saying goodbye to Wolf Blitzer, and then I like look over, and I'm like, and he's gone, and I'm like, Wolf Blitzer went to the bathroom, and I call that out, and then John saw his wife like texting him, being like, they're talking about you right now. And then he came back at the end of the show and then came backstage afterwards and was lovely. And he said that Trump didn't win, actually.
That was a joke, guys.
Yeah, very funny.
It's the reality we all want to be living in.
Yeah.
Let's open it up to the audience for questions. Who has questions out there?
Hi, this question is actually for Jeff. There were many scenes in the movie that were understated but weren't in the documentary, such as the interaction between Richard's mother and himself. So I was wondering if you could just talk about the creation of a scene like that, and maybe Joel can talk about that too.
Sure, I tried to base every scene on some fact that I could point to, which doesn't mean every scene is just a recreation, like the one you mentioned. That was built off of an interview that is in the documentary with his mother, where a reporter's asking her about how she feels about their relationship and about Mildred's family, which they grew up across the road from one another. And she says, I think they're good people. I like them. I think they're good people. And then he says, well, would you give your son, knowing what you know now, would you give your son any different advice about this? And she said, I don't know if I would, which isn't yes or no. It definitely was a woman who had never spoken to a reporter before, and you have to factor that in. But I just began to build this idea that she might have an opinion on all of this that is different than Richard's, and maybe more knowing. So that scene, although it's created by me, it's kind of inspired by a specific part in the documentary. And most scenes are like that. There are very few scenes that I can't point to something and tell you where I got this detail from. You know, for instance, kind of Richard's whole approach to the civil rights movement, but even the case that's happening around them, I drew a lot from this outtake in the archival footage. They're being asked to recount their story yet again. They've done it several times. And he's talking about the arrest and everything else. And then he gets to the part and he says, and she wrote a letter. And then he leans over to her and says, who'd you write that letter to? And she's like, Robert Kennedy. And he says, right, Robert Kennedy. You know, this is a man who in the mid-'60s couldn't call Robert Kennedy's name, you know, up like that. A man who had actually started the ball rolling in terms of the court case. So you take an outtake like that and you start to build your character's, you know, headspace out of it. You know, he doesn't understand the gravity of the situation in this first scene with Bernie Cohen, and you use a moment like that from the documentary footage to build that.
Next question.
This is for Nick and everyone. Has this movie changed how you see the legal profession or the Supreme Court and Constitution?
Well, as a side note, when I heard about the movie, I read it and started watching the documentary and stuff. And weirdly, my father had been at Georgetown Law School almost at the exact same time as Phil and Bernie, and had worked for Bobby Kennedy when he was there. So I felt a connection in general to that moment in time and what was happening legally. And I think it's amazing what can be accomplished. And I think right now, specifically with the leading up to the election and now the results of the election, of the power of what can happen, and specifically at the Supreme Court level, but also at all levels of the court. But what I also have taken from the movie, especially over the last week and a half since the election, is I think it's a really hopeful story to tell right now at this particular moment, because whatever happens in the legal proceedings, whether it's the Supreme Court or down through all the states and everything happening, is that at the end of the day, it's a story about two people who love each other and are taking action in their own personal lives about how they want to live and who they want to live with. And I think that is a powerful thing, and I think something that that right now, if people are upset or bummed about what's going on in the country or what the tone of the country is, that it's really people living their own specific lives that can make a difference and cumulatively can make a bigger difference. And they have to be supported by the legal system. But so I find it to be, at this particular moment, for me personally, a hopeful story that gives me hope.
Jeff, I would imagine, you started working on this, I think, in 2012. You said that when you were writing it, you were, at the very least, emotionally drawing parallels to what was going on in the Supreme Court with the Defense of Marriage Act.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you're aware as a storyteller that the audience is going to bring their thoughts and their issues and their belief systems into the movie with you. And you know that you don't have to mention marriage equality specifically. You don't have to mention gay marriage specifically to know that audience members are going to bring that in, a vast majority of them, and be thinking about that as they're watching this story. In 2012, that's when they were taking marriage equality state by state to try and win those rights in the event that it didn't go all the way to the Supreme Court. It's kind of an undeniable thing. I think Loving v. Virginia was cited 16 or 17 times in the Obergefell case. So the legal parallels are strictly important. But the social ones are important as well. When we think about this court case coming down in 1967, it wasn't like Richard and Mildred went back to Virginia and were immediately accepted. We have a lag time in society that sometimes follows, the vision of the Supreme Court in this case. I think it's also important to mention that in 1967, this was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Unanimous. I don't think that's something we're going to see for a little while. But we have to think as a society, it's on us to carry out the guidance of the Supreme Court. Yes, legally, this is a huge change and was a necessary change, certainly for the 16 states that forbid marriage based on race. But I think as a society, we have a responsibility to carry these things forward in practice, in everyday practice in our lives.
Absolutely. Guys, I have to let you go. I love the film so much. Congratulations. Thank you so much for being here. The film, Loving, is in theaters now. Go see it. It's incredible. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.